Clara had always been intrigued by urban legends. Among all of them, Bloody Mary was the most famous, and by now, she thought it was just a joke. "It's all made up," she thought, as she gazed into the bathroom mirror. The cool light of the dimly lit room bounced off the glass, casting a faint glow on her face. She had heard the story 1,000 times, how if you said Bloody Mary 3 times in front of a mirror, the ghostly figure would appear, vengeful and terrifying. But Clara wasn't one to fall for such superstitions. Still, a small part of her couldn't help but feel a little uneasy, her breath shallow as she stood in front of the mirror. She chuckled to herself, shaking her head. "I'm not a child," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. She stared into her own reflection, waiting for some sign of the mythical spirit to emerge. The seconds ticked by, stretching into an uncomfortable silence. Then she did it. One final laugh at the absurdity of it all. "Bloody Mary," she said aloud, her voice echoing in the stillness. The hairs on her arms prickled, but she quickly dismissed it as just her imagination running wild. She repeated the words, her heart beating a little faster now. Bloody Mary. Nothing happened. She was about to turn away when, in the corner of the mirror, something shifted. Just a flicker, so brief she wasn't sure if she had imagined it. Clara froze. The air seemed to grow colder, and a sense of dread began to crawl up her spine. She leaned in closer, eyes wide, searching her reflection. But it was only her, or so she thought. "Bloody Mary!" This time, her voice wavered. The lights flickered above her, and for a moment, everything around her seemed to stop. In the mirror, something moved. Just a shadow at first, but unmistakably there. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, her breathing quickening as her reflection twisted into something else entirely. The face that stared back at her was not hers. One night, home alone, Clara decided to test the legend. She had heard the stories, seen the wide-eyed warnings from friends, but deep down, she still believed it was all just a game. The thrill of disproving it was too tempting to resist. She turned off the lights, plunging the room into darkness. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the faint rustle of wind outside. With her heart thumping in her chest, Clara approached the bathroom mirror, her own reflection dimly visible in the darkness. Her fingers brushed the cold surface and she took a deep breath. "Bloody Mary," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. She waited for a moment, feeling the weight of silence settle around her. Nothing. The reflection staring back at her was just her own. Tired eyes, a lock of hair falling across her face, and the faintest hint of nervous excitement. She laughed softly to herself. "It's just a myth," she muttered. "Just a silly story." She repeated the words, a little louder this time. "Bloody Mary." Her voice was steady, but her hands suddenly felt clammy. Still, nothing. Clara stared at herself in the mirror, almost daring something to happen, yet knowing in the back of her mind that it wouldn't. She crossed her arms and gave herself a defiant look. "Bloody Mary," she said clearly, the 3rd time. The word hung in the air, thick with anticipation. The reflection remained unchanged, just her. She let out a breath of relief and rolled her eyes at her own foolishness. No sudden chill, no shadow creeping across the glass, no ghostly figure rising behind her. "See, I knew it," Clara muttered, turning away from the mirror with a smirk. But as she reached for the light switch, something strange happened. The reflection in the mirror lingered a moment longer than it should have. Just for a fraction of a second. Clara froze, her fingers hovering above the switch. She turned back to the mirror, her breath catching in her throat. The reflection wasn't moving quite right. But as she turned to leave, something made her pause. A chill filled the air, creeping over her skin like a cold hand. Clara frowned, the unease settling deeper in her chest. She glanced back at the mirror, her eyes searching the dark reflection, expecting to see nothing but her own image. Nothing. But still, something felt wrong. The air had thickened, the atmosphere heavy with an unseen presence. She swallowed, her pulse quickening. That feeling, that unsettling sensation that someone was watching her, was undeniable now. A faint whisper seemed to emanate from the glass. It was barely audible, a soft hiss that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The sound was so faint, so fragile, like a breath barely caught on the edge of a dream. Clara's breath hitched. She stared harder at the mirror, her heartbeat ringing in her ears. The whisper came again, clearer this time, though it was still barely more than a breath. Clara. Her name. A cold, creeping terror began to wrap around her, tightening like a vice. She stepped backward, eyes wide, unable to look away from the mirror. There, in the reflection, something was beginning to shift, a shape moving just at the edges of her vision. Not her own, no. Something else. The chill in the room intensified, biting at her skin. The whisper grew louder, no longer a faint sound, but a soft, insistent murmur, like a voice from the other side of the glass. Clara, come closer. Her pulse pounded in her throat. The reflection in the mirror, was it moving? Or was it just her mind playing tricks? The shape was clearer now, dark and swirling, like smoke gathering, thickening in the dim light. She could feel the air grow heavier, suffocating, pressing in on her from all sides. A shadow, shifting just behind her own reflection, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Come closer, the voice whispered again, but now it felt like it was right next to her ear. The mirror seemed to pull at her, the reflection distorting as if something was trying to crawl out of it. Frozen, Clara didn't know whether to run or stay. But one thing was certain, she wasn't alone anymore. At first, Clara thought it was the wind. It had to be. The house was old, and sometimes the air played tricks, slipping through cracks in the walls, making everything feel colder than it should. But the air was still now, unnervingly so. The room was heavy, thick, as if the atmosphere itself had shifted. It felt like the world had slowed down, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She took a cautious step back, her feet dragging against the cold floor. The whisper came again, clearer this time, unmistakable, slithering through the silence like a voice from the depths of the earth. You called me. The words were soft but charged with something chilling, something far too real. Clara's stomach lurched, her eyes snapping to the mirror, searching for any sign of movement. She couldn't see it. Nothing in the reflection had changed, but she could feel it. The air had thickened, heavy and oppressive, and the whisper was like a thread tying her to the glass, pulling her closer. Her hands trembled at her sides, her breath shallow, as if the very air she was breathing had turned to ice. You called me. The voice was louder now, insistent, the words echoing in the space around her. There was no mistake. It was coming from the mirror, not her reflection, but from behind it. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She wasn't alone. The reflection didn't just hold her image anymore. There was something else, something waiting on the other side. A cold finger of dread crawled up Clara's spine. She wanted to turn and run, to flee, but her legs refused to obey. She was rooted to the spot, the weight of the voice pulling her closer to the mirror, to whatever was on the other side. You called me, it repeated, a faint edge of menace creeping into the words. Now, you must face me. Clara's breath caught in her throat as the temperature in the room dropped even further, her vision clouding with the sense that something, or someone, was just beyond the glass, watching, waiting. Startled, Clara stepped closer to the mirror, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Her eyes were fixed on the glass, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The reflection, her own reflection, was gone. For a moment, all she could see was the dark emptiness of the mirror's surface, as if the glass had swallowed her image whole. Then, from the center of the stillness, something began to emerge. A pale shadow. It started as a smudge, a dark swirl in the center of the glass, like smoke curling and twisting, but it quickly solidified, growing into the shape of something human. Its edges were blurry, as if it wasn't fully part of the world around her. But there it was. There it was. Empty eyes. The shadow took form, stretching and bending unnaturally. The face that began to emerge was hollow, its features smooth and featureless, save for two gaping voids where eyes should have been. It was staring at her, through her, with an unblinking, suffocating gaze. The face was not hers, not even close, but it mirrored her in a way that was more horrifying than any reflection could ever be. Clara's breath caught in her throat, her body frozen in place. Her fingers reached out instinctively, but she couldn't tear her gaze away from the dark, faceless shape now staring back at her. The pale shadow's mouth began to move, stretching into a smile that was too wide, too sharp. It was mocking her, like it knew she was trapped, like it could feel her fear seeping into the air around her. The whisper came again, closer now, as if the voice had crossed the threshold of the mirror and was standing right next to her. "You called me." The words felt like they were clawing their way into her mind, sinking deep into her thoughts, drowning out everything else. Clara's pulse raced, her legs trembling beneath her as the shadow's form grew more solid, more real. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was something else, something ancient and hungry, and it was waiting for her. The woman in the mirror was moving, but Clara remained frozen. Every part of her wanted to look away, to flee, but her body refused to obey. Her feet felt glued to the floor, as if an invisible force had pressed her into place. It was as though the mirror itself had become a trap, pulling her in, making her a spectator in her own nightmare. The shadow in the reflection, that pale, faceless figure, began to move toward her. Slow, deliberate steps. Its movements were unnatural, jerky and distorted, as if it was struggling to exist in the space between worlds. But each step it took brought it closer, closer to her, until its distorted form was nearly pressed against the glass. The cold from the mirror seemed to seep into the room, filling the air with an icy weight. Clara's heart hammered in her chest. Panic crept slowly into her mind, curling around her thoughts like a slow, suffocating fog. Her breathing grew shallow, her hands trembling at her sides. She couldn't tear her gaze away, couldn't break the connection between herself and the thing in the mirror. The reflection moved again, but this time, Clara noticed something different. It was mimicking her. The woman in the mirror slowly lifted her hand, and Clara did the same. The reflection's movements were sharp, unsettling, like a puppet whose strings were pulled by something far beyond her control. But Clara wasn't moving. She hadn't lifted her hand. Her fingers were still rigid at her sides, her body unyielding, frozen by some invisible force. The thing in the mirror smiled, that terrible wide smile, and then it whispered again. But this time the voice was no longer distant. It was inside her head, scratching at her thoughts, twisting them. "You are mine now." Clara's throat constricted, and she struggled to breathe. The reflection began to reach toward her, slowly, almost lovingly, its hand pressing against the glass, just inches from where hers remained frozen. She could feel the coldness from the mirror, the ice-cold pressure against her skin, as if the glass were now an extension of the thing that haunted it. The whisper grew louder, the voice dark and cruel. "You called me." Her eyes locked onto the reflection, her breath ragged, her mind spiraling. It was coming closer, and she couldn't escape. No matter how hard she tried to move, to scream, her body refused to act, bound by some unseen force. The shadow's hand inched forward again, its fingers curling against the mirror as if it were about to reach through, and Clara was helpless to stop it. The figure in the mirror grinned, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was crooked, twisted with pain and rage, as if the flesh itself was tearing at the corners of her mouth. The smile stretched too wide, too unnaturally, distorting the features of the pale face. There was something wrong with it, something sick. The skin around the mouth seemed to stretch in jagged lines, as though it was being pulled by invisible strings, the edges raw and ripped, as if the reflection itself was trying to break free from the glass. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. She could feel a sickening pull in her stomach as the reflection's smile grew more grotesque, the sharp, jagged edges of its mouth now dripping with dark, viscous streaks. The air around her grew heavier, and the temperature plummeted. The cold seeped into her bones, making her limbs feel stiff and brittle. It was as if the mirror itself was becoming a doorway, a portal to something that wanted to break through. The figure's eyes, those empty, hollow voids, stared at Clara with a burning malice, the darkness in them swallowing everything in its path. It was no longer mimicking her movements. No, this thing was separate. It had its own will. It wasn't confined by the rules of the world that Clara knew. The reflection's smile twisted into something even more unnerving, the corners of its mouth splitting further, showing rows of uneven teeth, jagged and sharp, as if they weren't meant to be there at all. Clara wanted to scream, but her throat had gone dry, her body still locked in place, unable to move, to fight, to escape. The room felt smaller, closing in around her as the figure in the mirror pressed closer to the glass. Its breath, cold and damp, fogged up the surface, leaving streaks of mist that mirrored Clara's panic-stricken gaze. And then, in the silence that seemed to stretch on forever, the thing in the mirror spoke. Its voice was ragged, guttural, like the sound of glass being scraped against stone. "You shouldn't have called me." The whisper slithered into Clara's mind, turning her blood to ice, suffocating her in its dark presence. The smile grew even more distorted, the face beginning to fracture, like something was tearing through it, unraveling the very fabric of the reflection. The mirror began to crack. Clara tried to scream, but her voice was trapped in her throat, choked by a terror too thick to escape. Her lungs burned with the effort to cry out, but the sound wouldn't come. Her mouth opened, but the words, the desperate, terrified cries, stayed locked inside her. The figure in the mirror grinned wider, its jagged mouth stretching as if it could sense her helplessness. The air grew even colder, the icy tendrils of fear curling around Clara's limbs, binding her to the spot. Her legs felt like stone, unmovable, her body frozen in place by some invisible force. And then, the mirror began to shake. At first it was subtle, a slight tremor, as if the glass were vibrating with some distant, unheard noise. But it didn't stop. The shaking grew stronger, the edges of the mirror rattling against the wall, the glass trembling like it was struggling to hold itself together. Cracks began to spider across the surface, thin lines of darkness that spread out like veins. The reflection of the shadowy figure in the mirror twisted, warping as the glass trembled violently. It was as though something beyond the glass was trying to break through, trying to push its way into her world. Clara's heart pounded faster, her breath coming in shallow gasps, but still she couldn't move. The mirror continued to shake, the cracks spreading wider, the distortion in the reflection growing more pronounced. The face in the glass was no longer just a warped, twisted version of the woman. It was changing, becoming something else entirely, something far worse. The air vibrated with an unsettling hum, a noise that was neither loud nor silent, but a low, vibrating pulse that seemed to come from deep within the glass itself. The walls around her seemed to close in, as though the room was being consumed by the darkness that had spilled from the mirror. With a loud, sharp crack, the glass shattered. But instead of falling to the floor in shards, the pieces shifted, moving outward like dark liquid, as though the barrier between the two worlds had dissolved completely. The mirror itself seemed to melt into the air, the cracks growing, spilling blackness that swirled and writhed like it had a life of its own. Clara stumbled back, gasping, her mind screaming at her to run, to do something. But she was still frozen in place, trapped in the suffocating grip of whatever force had taken hold of her. The figure's hollow eyes locked onto hers, its jagged grin widening, pulling her deeper into its grasp. "You called me," it whispered again, the voice now inside her head, overwhelming and all-encompassing. And then the blackness surged forward, reaching for her, pulling her in. The woman's eyes started to stand out, black and lifeless, as though the glass itself had swallowed the light from them. They were deep, empty voids, swirling with a darkness that seemed to pull at Clara's very soul. The rest of her face remained frozen in that grotesque grin, but the eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, were the worst part. They locked onto Clara with an intensity that felt like it was boring straight into her chest, into her heart. And then, abruptly, the woman lifted her hand. Clara's breath hitched in her throat. The hand was pale, almost translucent, the fingers long and unnaturally thin. The nails, sharp and jagged like claws, gleamed in the dim light. For a moment it seemed to hover in midair, as though the figure was still unsure whether it was really touching the glass or if it could reach through. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the woman's hand made contact with the mirror. The sound of thin nails scratching echoed in the room, a high, grating sound that made Clara's skin crawl. The noise seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating off the walls, crawling into her bones, like the sound of something desperately trying to claw its way out of the mirror and into the world. Each scratch was a jagged scrape, a bone-chilling reminder that whatever was on the other side was not human, not anymore. Clara wanted to scream, to run, but her feet remained glued to the floor. The air around her seemed to grow heavier, the space between her and the mirror narrowing, suffocating her. The woman's nails scraped again, louder now, dragging down the surface of the glass with a noise that felt like it was scraping against her very soul. The hand pressed harder against the glass, as if it were testing the barrier between worlds, trying to break through. With each scrape, the reflection seemed to grow more solid, more real, and Clara could see the fingers elongating, distorting, the skin stretching and splitting as though it were not entirely alive. "Let me out," the woman's voice rasped, a twisted whisper that slithered into Clara's mind. The words were slow, deliberate, as though the figure was savoring the fear in Clara's eyes. The hand pressed harder, the scratching growing more frantic. "Let me out," it repeated, the voice growing louder, more desperate. The mirror began to crack again, the glass splintering beneath the pressure, the blackness behind the reflection seeping through the cracks like ink bleeding into water. Clara took a shaky step back, but still, her feet refused to move. The hand on the glass seemed to press against her, as though it was reaching for her, pulling her toward the dark, lifeless eyes that stared back at her with pure malice. And just as she thought she might break free, the hand slid down the glass, leaving a trail of blackness in its wake. The woman's smile twisted further. And then, she reached. Clara felt a sharp pain in her chest, a pressure building deep within her ribs as though something was twisting inside her. It started as a dull ache, but it quickly intensified, sharp and unrelenting. The sensation was foreign, unnatural, like invisible hands were digging into her skin, pulling from the inside out. She gasped, clutching at her chest, her breath shallow and panicked. The mirror in front of her seemed to pulse, the black void of the reflection rippling like water disturbed by a stone. She could feel the pull, something deep within the glass, an unseen force tugging at her very being. It was as if the mirror wasn't just a reflection anymore, but a doorway, a gate to something beyond, something dark and suffocating. The pressure in her chest grew stronger, harder, and Clara stumbled forward, her legs weak beneath her. Her vision blurred, and she could no longer tear her eyes away from the figure in the mirror, that faceless thing with the twisted grin. The shadow in the glass reached out, its hand stretching toward her. Its fingers seemed to elongate, distorting as they inched closer, closer to where she stood. And then, the pain in her chest became unbearable, a vice tightening around her heart, as though the mirror was pulling at her from the other side. "Let go," the voice whispered in her mind, softer now, but still dripping with malice. "Come to me." Clara's hands shot out, instinctively trying to push away to escape the pull. But the force was too strong. The glass shimmered, the edges of the mirror seeming to bleed away into darkness, and she felt herself being dragged, inexorably, toward it. Her feet slid across the floor, unable to resist the invisible current pulling her toward the cold, dark glass. The edges of her vision began to distort, her surroundings warping as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. Her skin tingled with cold, her breath coming in ragged gasps. With one final, desperate gasp, she reached for anything, but her fingers met only the smooth, icy surface of the mirror. The sharp pain in her chest flared, a blinding flash of agony that made her knees buckle. And then, with a final, heart-stopping pull, Clara felt herself being yanked forward, her body crossing the threshold. And the world around her vanished. She tried to back away, but her feet wouldn't move, as if the ground beneath her had become part of the mirror itself, anchoring her in place. Her heart raced, pounding in her chest, and every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape, but her legs remained stiff, unyielding. The pressure in her chest was suffocating, a cold weight pressing down on her from all sides. Desperate, Clara glanced behind her, hoping for some sign of safety, some way out. But as she turned, her breath caught in her throat. The reflection in the mirror had changed. It wasn't her anymore. The woman, or whatever it was, had distorted beyond recognition. Her features were stretched and warped, jagged like broken glass, her skin now an unnatural shade of pale, as though the very essence of her had been drained away. Her body twisted unnaturally, her limbs too long, bending in ways that no human form should. It was like a nightmare taking shape, every inch of the reflection contorting into something darker, more grotesque. The eyes, those hollow black voids, were now filled with something alive, something feral, burning with malice. They weren't just staring at Clara anymore. They followed her, tracking her every movement. The twisted mouth gaped wider, stretching impossibly, exposing jagged teeth like shards of bone. The smile was no longer mocking. It was filled with an insatiable hunger, as if it was waiting for her to step forward, to be consumed. The reflection's body moved, but not in the same way Clara did. It jerked and shuddered, as if it were trying to escape the mirror's confines, trying to break free and crawl into her world. The glass itself seemed to ripple, distorting like water, and Clara could feel the edges of the reflection pressing against the boundary, straining to push through. She tried to scream, but the sound caught in her throat. Her legs trembled, but she could still not move. The thing in the mirror grinned, its mouth splitting further as it reached a hand toward her, its fingers elongating into claws. Every part of her screamed for escape, but there was nowhere to go. The reflection was no longer just a reflection. It had become something else entirely, something alive. And then, in that moment of sheer terror, the distorted figure stepped forward, its foot crossing the line of the glass. The surface of the mirror cracked with a thunderous sound, and the shadow surged through. Its hollow eyes locked onto Clara's with a hunger she could feel deep in her bones. It was coming for her. With cold hands, Clara forced her eyes to break away, but the moment she did, a chill washed over her, as if the very act of looking away had made her more vulnerable. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last. She tried to turn, to move, to escape, but the weight of the air around her kept her rooted to the spot, her body frozen in a terror she couldn't shake. She glanced back at the mirror. The woman in the reflection had grown larger, far larger, until the entire surface of the glass was consumed by her twisted, contorted form. The face, once faint and distant, now filled the entire mirror, its features grotesque and ever-changing, like something caught in a nightmare that couldn't be shaken free. The woman's mouth stretched impossibly wide, the jagged teeth gnashing and tearing through the air, her hollow eyes burning with an intensity that threatened to swallow Clara whole. The reflection didn't just stand there anymore. It moved, its body rippling, distorting, as if it was pulling itself from within the glass, pulling its limbs out from the depths of the mirror. The woman's hands, no longer just reaching, pressed against the surface of the glass, her fingers elongating into claws, scratching and scraping the surface with a sickening screech. The sound of her nails dragging against the mirror was unbearable, a high-pitched wail that seemed to echo in every corner of the room. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She tried to look away again, but the reflection was no longer just in front of her. It was everywhere. The woman's face, now twisted with rage and hunger, filled every inch of the mirror, every corner of the glass, suffocating her with its presence. The image was so close, so real, that Clara could almost feel the cold, clammy touch of the reflection's hand against her skin. The smile on the woman's face twisted, stretching further, and the darkness in her eyes seemed to expand, swallowing the light, pulling Clara into its depths. The air around her grew suffocating, the glass now a thick, living thing, as though the woman was trying to claw her way out. "Come closer," the voice whispered. But it wasn't coming from the mirror anymore. It was inside her head, crawling through her thoughts, wrapping around her mind like a vice. Clara took a trembling step back, but the image in the mirror didn't relent. It grew, it pressed against her, like the reflection was pushing through, becoming the world itself. And then, with a horrifying crack, the mirror began to splinter, and the reflection, still grinning, reached forward, out of the glass. The air in the bathroom grew thick, laden with an unbearable tension, as though the very atmosphere had become heavy with something unspeakable. Each breath Clara took felt like it was being stolen from her, as if the room itself was suffocating her. The faint hum of the world outside seemed to vanish, leaving only a dreadful silence that pressed in on all sides, making her skin crawl. Her heart raced, every beat a loud drum in her ears, but the coldness that surrounded her seemed to grow deeper, more oppressive. It was as if the space was shrinking, closing in around her, and the mirror, once a simple reflection of the room, had now become an insatiable void. Clara could feel it, watching her. She wasn't just standing before it anymore. The mirror had become alive, pulling her in with an invisible force that tightened around her chest. She felt as though 1,000 eyes were watching her. No, more than that. It wasn't just the reflection of the woman. The very surface of the mirror seemed to be alive, filled with countless unseen gazes, pressing into her with a weight that was suffocating. Every inch of the glass felt like it was filled with a presence, an oppressive force that was waiting for her to move, to make a mistake, to give in. The reflection in the mirror warped, bending and twisting, as though the glass was no longer a barrier, but a conduit to something darker. Clara's own face stared back at her, pale and wide-eyed, but the eyes of the woman, moved. They followed her every breath, her every shift, as if they could see into her very soul, pulling at her from within. The smile twisted wider, stretching impossibly, until it looked more like a snarl, filled with a hunger that seemed to reach out from the mirror. Her throat tightened and she tried to step back, but her feet were stuck, anchored to the floor as if the very ground had become part of the reflection. It was as if the mirror was swallowing her, pulling her deeper into its depths, until there was nothing left but the cold, lifeless stare of the woman and the suffocating weight of the darkened glass. Clara's vision blurred, her body trembling as the darkness inside the mirror began to bleed out, spilling into the room. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. The mirror had become a door, a gateway to something far worse. She could feel the pull of it, like it was calling to her, calling for her to surrender. And in that moment, Clara realized with a sickening clarity that the mirror had already taken her. She was no longer just looking into it, she was trapped within it. "You called me," the woman repeated, her voice deep and drawn out, as though each word were a curse, each syllable laced with venom. The sound slithered through Clara's mind, curling around her thoughts, wrapping them in darkness. It was no longer just a voice. It was the voice, the one that had been waiting, lurking, growing stronger with each breath Clara took. The words echoed in the room, reverberating off the walls like a sinister chant, filling the space with an overwhelming sense of dread. The mirror trembled, the surface rippling with unnatural energy, as though the very air around Clara was alive, pulsating with the weight of the woman's presence. Clara's legs felt weak, her body shaking uncontrollably, yet still, She couldn't tear her eyes away from the woman in the mirror. The figure's eyes, dark and empty, never left her face, watching her with an intensity that went beyond fear. It was possessive, hungry, as if the woman had been waiting for Clara, as if she had been summoned, called here for this moment. The smile on the woman's face widened, but there was nothing remotely human about it. It stretched too far, the skin at the corners of her mouth tearing, bloodless, as if the flesh itself were breaking under the strain. The reflection's body twitched, jerking in odd, unnatural ways, and Clara could hear the crackling of bones, like something inside the figure was shifting, contorting to a form that wasn't meant for this world. "You called me," she said again, the voice dripping with malicious intent. The words were a promise, a warning, a thing that could never be undone. And as she spoke, the glass of the mirror began to fracture, each crack an invitation, each line a thread pulling Clara closer to whatever lay behind the reflection. Clara's breath hitched, her throat tightening, but she couldn't speak. She couldn't fight it. There was no escaping the growing pull, the pressure building in her chest as though the very essence of the woman was suffocating her, trying to draw her into the glass. And as the reflection's lips curled into that monstrous smile, Clara understood. She hadn't just summoned the woman. She had invited something much darker, much older, a thing that had been waiting in the shadows of the mirror for her. "You belong to me now," the woman whispered, her voice a serpent's hiss, and with that, the cracks in the glass widened, the darkness spilling forward, reaching for Clara like the claws of something ancient and hungry. Clara took a step back, her heart racing as panic flooded her veins. But the moment her foot lifted, her reflection in the mirror mirrored her every movement, perfectly synchronized, as if it were following her. The strange thing wasn't that it mimicked her, it was that it didn't feel like her own reflection anymore. Her reflection didn't just follow her, it watched her with an unnatural stillness. Its eyes, those hollow dark pits, focused on her with a hunger that made Clara's skin crawl. She froze, unable to look away as the mirror seemed to distort, the edges of the glass warping and pulsing with a sickly light. And then something far worse happened. The shadow in the mirror, the one that had once been a faceless, twisted figure, was now right behind her. She hadn't seen it move, hadn't heard it shift, but there it was, standing inches away from her in the reflection, its eyes locked onto hers with a malevolent gleam that sent chills down her spine. Clara's breath hitched. The shadow didn't just mimic the movement of her own body, it knew her. It was moving like her, copying her actions, but with a terrifying slowness, as if it were savoring the moments before it made its move. Its hands, once trembling, now reached forward, the fingers stretching, elongating, darkened nails curling like claws. In the reflection, Clara saw herself slowly turning around, instinctively trying to move away. But the shadow moved at the same time. It was no longer just a reflection, it was something separate, something that had broken free of the glass. Her breath caught in her throat. She could feel the coldness of its presence behind her, even though she dared not look back. Her own reflection was now twisted, its face distorted with that same unnatural smile that had once been the woman's, a grin that was too wide, too sharp. She took another step back, heart thundering in her chest, and the shadow in the mirror stepped forward. It followed her every move, and the space between her and the reflection in the mirror was closing. But this time, the reflection was no longer just watching. It was moving as though it was going to reach out, to touch her. The air in the room grew frigid, the silence so thick Clara could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. And as she finally dared to glance over her shoulder, she saw it. The reflection's hand was inches from her back, its cold, black fingers stretching toward her. But when she turned around, the room was empty. The mirror, though, wasn't. With wide eyes, Clara watched in frozen terror as the woman's fingernails stretched, elongating unnaturally, growing longer and longer with each passing second. The tips of the fingers curled, twisting and hardening into sharp, jagged claws, their pale surface gleaming in the dim light. A sickening sound filled the room, a horrible scraping, like the gnashing of bones against glass. The nails scraped the surface of the mirror with such force that it sounded like the very fabric of the glass was being torn apart. The noise was deafening, a blood-curdling screech that reverberated through Clara's skull, setting her nerves on edge. Each scrape was a jagged cry of desperation, as though the woman in the mirror was trying to tear her way through, desperate to escape, desperate to reach her. Clara's breath hitched, her body paralyzed in place as she watched the reflection's claws dig into the mirror, leaving deep, dark marks in the once clear surface. The woman's face remained twisted in that terrifying grin, her black eyes gleaming with malice, watching Clara with a hunger that seemed to go beyond anything human. The reflection's fingers gripped the glass now, pulling and stretching, as if the mirror was no longer just a boundary. It was a prison, one that the woman was determined to break out of. The nails scraped harder, faster, the sound now a constant shriek of pain and fury, as if the very reflection of the woman was tearing at the very air around them. Clara's heart raced, her legs weak beneath her, her body begging her to move, to run. But the terror rooted her to the spot. The figure in the mirror, no, it wasn't just a reflection anymore, was alive. And it was getting closer, inch by inch, its claws scraping through the glass with relentless force. The woman's face distorted further, her features pulling into an expression of sheer rage, her mouth widening into a twisted, impossible grin. Her hands, now fully formed into terrifying claws, pounded against the glass, each strike shaking the mirror's surface with a force that seemed to rattle Clara's very bones. And then, with a sudden, violent crack, the glass splintered. Desperate to escape, Clara turned and stumbled backward, her pulse racing. But as her eyes flicked toward the mirror, a chill crawled up her spine. The room felt smaller, suffocating, and she realized with growing horror that the mirror had become a prison. Every time she moved, every step she took, the reflection in the glass did the exact same thing, precisely the same. It was like an eerie twin, mimicking her every action with unnerving precision. But there was something wrong about it. The reflection wasn't just copying her. It was staring back at her, its eyes locked onto hers with a chilling intensity, as if it were fully aware of the terror radiating from Clara. The smile on the mirrored version of her face was distorted, twisted into something cold and mocking. Clara's heart pounded as she took another frantic step back, but the reflection followed, its movement slow and deliberate, as though it were savoring her fear. She tried to wave her hands, tried to look anywhere but the mirror, but the reflection always mirrored her, an unblinking, silent double that refused to let her escape. She twisted to the left, and the reflection did the same. She jerked to the right, and once again, it mirrored her perfectly. Her body was moving, but it was as if she were trapped inside a loop, unable to break free, unable to break the eerie connection between herself and the figure in the glass. It wasn't just an imitation. It was too perfect, too precise. And yet, with every move she made, the reflection felt off. It wasn't her, not anymore. Panic flooded her chest as the reflection's grin stretched wider, more menacing, almost as if it knew that Clara was trapped in a cycle of helplessness, unable to break the link between them. The mirror, once a simple surface, now felt like a barrier, an impenetrable wall that refused to release her. Each desperate move she made only seemed to drag her further into its grip. She wanted to scream, to cry for help, but her throat was tight, choked with the terror rising inside her. She was locked inside the prison of the mirror with no way out. The reflection kept following, its gaze colder, its smile darker, and Clara felt a bone-deep certainty that she was no longer just looking at a reflection. It was something far worse. It was alive, and it was getting closer. The sound of glass cracking echoed through the room, sharp and jarring, reverberating in Clara's chest like a thunderclap. Her heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat as her eyes darted to the mirror. She expected to see it shattered, fractured into a million jagged pieces. But when she looked closer, there was nothing. Nothing at all. No cracks, no shards, no sign of damage. The surface of the mirror remained smooth, untouched. But something else had changed. A thick, heavy fog was creeping across the glass, swirling and coiling like smoke, dense and unnatural, obscuring the reflection. It moved slowly, tendrils of mist curling around the edges of the mirror, blurring the image of the room behind it. The fog seemed to breathe, shifting as if it had a life of its own, seeping across the surface like a living thing. Clara's pulse quickened as she stepped closer, her eyes wide with confusion and dread. The room around her felt colder, the air thick with the presence of something dark, something otherworldly. The fog continued to grow, spreading further across the glass, until the mirror was completely veiled, the reflection now lost beneath the haze. And then, from the depths of the fog, a figure began to emerge. At first, it was only a shadow, a vague silhouette that seemed to shift and writhe in the mist. But as it took shape, Clara's stomach churned with fear. The form was humanoid, but it was wrong, twisted, distorted, as though it had been made from the very fog itself. The edges of its body blurred and morphed, like something caught between worlds, something trying to claw its way through the veil. Clara froze, unable to move as the figure's head turned toward her. The eyes, those empty black pits, locked onto hers with an intensity that felt as though they were reaching into her very soul. A smile twisted across the figure's face, but it wasn't a smile of joy or mischief. It was a grin filled with malice, a grin that promised something dark, something dangerous. The fog thickened, and as it did, the figure stepped closer, its form becoming more solid, more real, as though the mirror itself was bending, stretching to let it through. Clara's breath quickened, her mind screaming at her to run, but her body remained frozen, her feet glued to the floor. The reflection in the mirror was no longer hers. The fog had consumed it, replaced it with something else, something that had been waiting for her, lurking just behind the glass. And then, with a sickening slowness, the figure raised a hand toward her, the fingers long and bony, tipped with nails that glinted like knives. Clara couldn't look away. She couldn't move. The mirror was no longer a reflection. It was a gateway, a doorway to something far darker, and it was pulling her in. The woman's grin grew wider, impossibly so, stretching her face into a grotesque mockery of a smile, her teeth jagged and sharp like broken glass. Clara's blood ran cold as the reflection in the mirror seemed to shift, its hollow eyes burning with an intensity that felt like they were searing into her very soul. With a muffled scream, Clara felt a sudden, violent pull, a force stronger than anything she'd ever experienced, yank her forward toward the mirror. Her body moved against her will, her feet sliding on the floor, as if the very air was resisting her. She reached out, her hands desperately gripping at the edge of the sink, anything to hold herself in place. But it was futile. The force dragging her was relentless, an invisible hand that seemed to come from the mirror itself. She tried to scream again, but the sound was choked, trapped in her throat as she felt herself slipping inch by inch toward the glass. Her heart pounded in her chest, panic rising to an overwhelming crescendo, but her muscles were frozen, her body unable to fight the pull. It was as though the mirror had become alive, a living, breathing entity that was determined to drag her inside. Clara's mind screamed for escape, for freedom, but the reflection was closing in. The woman's twisted grin widening further as she reached out a hand, her long fingers stretching toward Clara with malevolent intent. The glass shimmered, rippling like water, distorting the world around her, blurring the line between reality and the nightmare unfolding before her. The mirror no longer felt like a reflection. It felt like a portal, a gateway to something dark, something she couldn't comprehend. The edges of the glass rippled with a deep, unnatural energy, as if it were sucking the room itself into its depths. The familiar walls, the quiet bathroom, all faded, swallowed by the growing darkness inside the mirror. Clara felt the air around her grow colder, sharper, as if the temperature itself was plummeting to impossible depths. The woman in the mirror reached out further, her claws inches from Clara's skin. The pull became unbearable, and despite every ounce of her will, Clara felt her body being dragged forward, her face inching closer to the glass, the cold surface now brushing against her skin. She tried one last time to break free, to resist, but it was no use. The mirror wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was a trap, and Clara was its prey. With a final wrenching yank, the force pulled her into the mirror, her vision blurring as the world around her fractured, split, and faded into darkness. The last thing Clara saw before she was consumed by the void was the woman's grin, wider, hungry, and all-encompassing. In the next moment, everything fell silent. The air grew still, the oppressive tension vanishing as if it had never existed. The world outside the bathroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting. But Clara was gone. When her parents returned home hours later, they were met with an unsettling quiet. The house felt empty in a way it never had before. They called out for Clara, their voices echoing through the hallways, but there was no answer. The bathroom door stood ajar, the light flickering slightly above it, casting long shadows across the floor. They pushed the door open, expecting to find her, perhaps just lost in thought or trying to make sense of something that had scared her. But the room was empty, completely empty, save for the faint scent of something cold, metallic, like the air after a storm. The mirror on the wall, which had once reflected the room in crisp detail, now showed nothing but a deep, endless void. It wasn't dark, not exactly. It was like the glass itself had swallowed the very concept of reflection. The surface pulsed faintly, a swirling abyss that seemed to stretch into an impossible distance. Her parents stepped closer, their breath catching as they stared at the mirror. It was as though the glass was alive, breathing in a way that made their skin prickle with unease. There was no sign of Clara, no trace of her. Only the black emptiness that stared back at them, cold and unblinking. They called her name again, their voices shaky with fear, but the silence that followed was deafening. There was no sound, no movement, nothing but that endless void staring back at them. Clara was never seen again. The police searched, questioned neighbors, and scoured the house for any sign of her, but it was as if she had vanished from existence entirely. No one knew where she went, or why. The bathroom, now sealed off from the rest of the house, remained unchanged, save for the mirror, that strange, empty mirror. It continued to reflect the void, day after day, as if it were waiting for something, or someone, to fill the darkness once more. Years passed, but the mystery of Clara's disappearance never faded. And the house, now abandoned, remains a place of whispered rumors and dark stories. But one thing remains certain. The mirror is still there, reflecting nothing but the endless, cold void. And sometimes, if you stand close enough and stare long enough, you can almost feel it calling you.